Hey crews, Xander here from the Apparatus Committee. We're just here to talk about the new hose and nozzles that we're getting put in service for the Arlington Legacy engines. The information we're going over today is nothing new for the Legacy North County folks, but we just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about why we purchased the nozzles that we purchased, why we purchased the hose that we purchased, and go over a few other things. One other thing that we're going to talk about is what we're going to for our apartment packs, as far as how we're reducing down from an 1.5" coupling to a 2.5" coupling using a bell swivel reducer versus using our gated Y will be the new standard. Attached in this email is a link with the study that outlines the reasons behind why we went to the bell reducers and some great videos from Elkhart Brass himself. All right, just a little bit of history on why we picked the nozzles that we picked. So when we first looked at our attack package, one of the things that we wanted to have was a nozzle with a low nozzle reaction to have a good combat mobility, to make it easier for us to be able to do the jobs that we need to do inside of the fire room, inside of the fire. So we're looking at low pressure nozzles. So that is going for 50 PSI at the tip versus what we were used to was we had some 100 PSI at the tip nozzles and some 75 PSI at the tip nozzles. These nozzles, and if you've been a part of the engine company block train over the last couple of weeks, you've noticed have a much lower nozzle reaction and make it easier for us to apply our water properly inside of a burning building. To start out with, there were two sizes that we looked at as far as a smoothbore nozzle that have a low nozzle reaction, one being the 7/8 and one being the 15/16. The 7/8 gives us 160 gallons per minute at 50 PSI. We can over pump it or under pump it to achieve more gallons per minute or less gallons per minute. Versus our 15/16 nozzle gave us 185 gallons per 185 gallons per minute at 50 PSI. The one reason we went with the 7/8 was that it has a lower nozzle reaction, making it easier for us to handle that. For an example, like a FDNY, the nozzle that they use is a 15/16 tip, but they also dedicate about 8 people to one hose line where we have about 2 people. So we went with the option that gave us still a good flow in that target range that NFPA wants us to be in, with still having a good combat mobility. We also looked at combination nozzles that flow 160 gallons per minute at 50 PSI. And these will be available for use on our engines, even though our primary nozzle will be the 7/8 smoothbore. One of the things that we have issue with the combination nozzle is more moving parts and more probability for clogging. Another thing that we see with a combination nozzle is it is less responsive to our movement, meaning that the stream is a little bit lazier when we move the line. It doesn't give the response that we want as we move the nozzle. We get a better reaction from our movement with a smoothbore nozzle. So the nozzle that we end up picking for our 1 3/4 line was the 7/8. For our 2.5 was the 1 1/8. And another thing that we were trying to accomplish was having some simplicity in the pressures that we flow for our nozzles and some simplicity in the friction loss numbers that we have to calculate on the fire ground. So I don't know about the specifics of Arlington, but when we went through this study for North County, we had about 3 to 4 different pressures depending on what unit you worked on, because we have different types of nozzles that have different pressure ratings and also had different ratings for gallons per minute, which changes our friction loss. It means we had a lot of numbers that we had to calculate and work through to just flow one line depending on what unit you were working on. So we wanted to make that simple for us. So the nozzle package that we have now, whether we are flowing an 1 3/4 that is a smoothbore or an 1 3/4 that is a combination nozzle, they will be pumped the exact same. This nozzle flows 160 gallons per minute at 50 PSI at the tip. This flows 160 gallons per minute with 50 PSI at the tip. And the same thing goes across for our 2.5 nozzles. 265 gallons per minute with 50 PSI at the tip, our combination, 265 gallons per minute at 50 PSI. Another thing that we accomplished with this new attack package is that every single nozzle, whether it be an 1 3/4 nozzle or a 2.5 nozzle, all have the same pressure at the tip. So now we only have really a couple numbers that we have to remember as driver operators. Our friction loss for our 1 3/4 when we're flowing an 1 3/4 nozzle, our friction loss for a 2.5 when we're flowing a 2.5 nozzle, and our friction loss in our 2.5 hose when we have it extended 1 3/4 nozzle off the end of it. So really only 3 numbers that we have to remember as far as our friction loss numbers go. A lot of you guys have all worked at North County Legacy stations and have seen the pump cards that have been published there. The little, they kind of look like a little credit card. More of those are being printed out and they will be placed on the Arlington rigs and around the Arlington stations. If you guys ever need a pump card, please ask myself, or Kaylee is the one who has kindly printed those all out for us. And you guys will see this set up very simply, and we'll make an attachment in this email that also outlines all of our pump discharge pressures and the flow rates that we have and the friction loss for each type of hose. So once we picked the nozzle package that we wanted, the next thing we had to do was pair a hose with it. So we did a hose evaluation and worked with industry leading experts who serve throughout the country and know a lot more than myself about what type of hose we would want to be using for the nozzle package. When we take a look at our hose that we had, we found that our hose, our 1 3/4 for instance, was not actually 1 3/4. It was closer to like 1.92 inches versus 1.75 inches. And there was a common thread across all of our hose, and if we were to measure the hose at Arlington, I would guarantee that a lot of that hose was the same. We found the same thing to be true for our 2.5. A lot of our 2.5 was not truly 2.5 inches. Some of it was even closer to actually being 3 inches on inside diameter, which means that our friction loss calculations would be off. And the other thing would be that we would be carrying around extra weight. For instance, 100 feet of 2.5 that is closer to 2.75, that's an extra 100 pounds of weight that we're carrying around for no good reason. So the hose that we got was what you guys may commonly hear is called like a true ID, meaning that it is actually the internal diameter is actually what we ask for. So our 1 3/4 hose is actually 1.77 inches, which if we look at some other data like the Freeman ratio, this pairs really well with a 7/8 nozzle because of the way that the velocity, the water behaves in the velocity in the hose and then as it's coming out of the nozzle. A great place to find some more information on that would be Elkhart's YouTube page, Brass Tacks and Hard Facts, and they have a video specifically explaining the Freeman ratio. And the same thing pairs as we look at our 2.5. 2.5 pairs really well with a 1 1/8 tip. Another property that we wanted in the hose, we wanted the hose to work well for us with our lower pressure nozzles. When we have higher pressure in our hose, it keeps the hose open. When we're using lower pressure nozzles to have that lower nozzle reaction, we need a hose that has a stiffer jacket. So after testing several different brands of hose, the one that we picked was Matex Cobra Combat, and it has turned out to be a great nozzle and hose package for us thus far, and this will be the nozzle package that will be going on engine 46 and ladder 48 in any future engine. All of the hose comes from the manufacturer pre-tested for us, and it is all marked with the year and then a consecutive number to make it easy for us to identify and easy for the folks who do our hose testing. All the 1 3/4 hose will be this nice bright green, and all the 2.5 will be this bright orange. We wanted to pick some different colors than anything that might be out there in any of the stations, so we can really identify that we have the right hose on the rigs when we do our rig checks. Another thing we wanted to address in this video is for all of the rigs that have crosslays, that have the checks and swivels, the discharges in the middle of the hose bed, we have purchased these little jumpers that will go from that discharge to our full 200-foot crosslay to make it easier to remove that hose if it's dirty, to roll it up to get all the air and water out of it before loading it. We flow tested this hose to see if there was any major friction loss in here, and it's less than 2 psi, so it's something we're comfortable not even accounting for when we pump our lines. Again, our nozzle firefighter is still going to verify that pressure to make sure that it feels good to them, and we can adjust it at the pump panel as needed, but it's not something we need to add into our calculation. We can still use our standard discharge pressures. These will be for the 1 3/4 lines as well as the 2.5 lines. Any of the engines that do not have that in the middle, they already have a discharge on the outside, nothing will change with those engines. One more thing to address in this video, to save on some cost on some of our nozzles, we took a lot of our old Elkhart Chiefs that used to be stemmed at 150 gallons per minute at 75 psi, and we re-stemmed them at 150 gallons per minute at 50 psi. We would have ideally wanted them to be 160 gallons per minute at 50 psi to have 100% match to this nozzle, but they do not make that stem. So they are 150 gallons per minute at 50 psi. These are only going to be really used on our tenders and on our bumper lines on some of our rigs until we can completely phase them out and go, all the rigs will have the XD nozzles. So you may see these on some of our tenders, our backup rigs, or on our bumper lines. They can still be pumped to the same pressure that we would pump this nozzle. You get a few gallons less per minute, but we're comfortable with this for these being on tenders where these lines are very infrequently used. To recap, soon here, I'm hoping by the end of the month, we will have on all of our rigs the same attack package. 1 3/4 will have a 7/8 smooth bore paired with our green 1.77 hose. Our 2.5s will have a an 1.125 tip paired with a 2.5 hose, the orange. In our engineers compartments, so that if we want to use them, we will be keeping these tips. They can be changed out depending on crew preference, but again, they have the same pressures and the same gallons per minute, so nothing will change if you are a driver, no matter what tip is on there. These will be kept in the engineers compartments to be used for anybody who wants to use them, and we will also have these still on the bumper lines. We'll have the combination nozzles. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions, please reach out to me or any apparatus committee member.